Suguru Gojo may just be the most powerful sorcerer in Jujutsu Kaisen history, but what if I told you that his overwhelming strength is actually his greatest curse, and that the man we see as this untouchable, godlike figure is actually the most trapped character in the entire series? Well, I'm about to take you through every single moment that shaped the strongest into who he really is. Because although we call him the Honored One and worship his incredible abilities, the real story of Gojo is one of profound isolation and the desperate search for human connection. And together we'll discover how the very thing that makes him the most powerful also makes him the loneliest, and how his entire character arc is really about learning to connect with others despite being fundamentally different from everyone around him. It's a story of power and isolation of friendship and betrayal of teaching and redemption and ultimately of sacrifice and legacy. So get ready, sit back, grab a snack if you want, and enjoy this deep dive into the tragic life of Satoru Gojo. Because by the end, you'll understand that his greatest victory wasn't in his strength, but in the connections he built along the way. The story of Satoru Gojo begins not with triumph, but with a burden that would define his entire existence. Because when he was born, he came into this world carrying two of the most powerful abilities in Jujutsu history, the Six Eyes and the Limitless technique. And here's the thing, this combination hadn't appeared in a single person for over 400 years, which meant that from the moment he took his first breath, Gojo was marked as something special, something dangerous, and something that needed to be either protected or eliminated. And I mean, can you imagine being born and immediately becoming a target for assassination attempts? Because that's exactly what happened to baby Gojo. The mere fact of his existence shifted the balance of power in the Jujutsu world so dramatically that people were willing to kill an infant just to prevent him from growing up. And this early experience of being valued not for who he was, but for what he could do would set the tone for his entire childhood, where he was constantly surrounded by adults who saw him as a weapon first and a child second. And could it be that his playful personality that we see throughout the series, actually a defense mechanism developed from years of being treated as a weapon rather than a child? Maybe his carefree attitude and constant joking around is his way of asserting his humanity in a world that only sees him for his power, and this childhood isolation where everyone around him was either trying to use him or kill him would plant the seeds for the loneliness that would plague him for the rest of his life. Because how do you form normal relationships when everyone you meet already has preconceived notions about what you are rather than who you are? But everything changed when Gojo entered Jujutsu High, because this is where he met the one person who would come to understand him, not as the strongest, but as Satoru. And that person was Suguru Geto. And wow, their friendship during this period was something truly beautiful to witness. Because for the first time in his life, Gojo had someone who could match his strength, and more importantly, someone who saw him as an equal rather than a god to be worshipped, or a threat to be eliminated, and their dynamic as the strongest duo was incredible. They complemented each other perfectly, with Geto's more serious and thoughtful nature, balancing out Gojo's playful and impulsive personality, and together they were unstoppable, taking on missions that would have been impossible for anyone else. And during this time, we see glimpses of who Gojo really is underneath all that power. A young man who just wants to protect people and make the world a better place. And his friendship with Geto gave him something he'd never had before, a sense of belonging and understanding, because Geto didn't just accept Gojo's strength, he celebrated it and encouraged him to use it for good. This period represents the happiest time in Gojo's life, where he finally felt like he had found his place in the world and someone who truly understood him. But now here's where it gets interesting. This period of happiness, brotherhood, was actually setting up Gojo's greatest tragedy. And I'll explain why this friendship that meant everything to him would ultimately become the source of his deepest pain. So stay tuned for that, because what happens next will change everything we thought we knew about both characters. The turning point in Gojo's life came during the Star Plasma Vessel arc, and this mission would shatter everything he thought he knew about himself, the Jujutsu world, and his place in it. Because when he and Geto were assigned to protect Riko Amanai, they thought it would be just another mission, where their combined strength would be enough to handle any threat, but they were wrong. So very wrong, because they encountered Toji Fushiguro, the sorcerer killer, a man who had no cursed energy, but who had trained his body and mind to be the perfect weapon against sorcerers. And in their first encounter, Toji did something that had never happened before. He defeated Satoru Gojo, and not only defeated him, but killed him. And this moment was absolutely devastating, because for the first time in his life, Gojo experienced true powerlessness and the crushing realization that all his strength meant nothing if he couldn't protect the people he cared about. And as he lay dying, Gojo had to confront the possibility that maybe he wasn't as special as everyone thought. Maybe he was just another sorcerer who could be killed like anyone else. But then something incredible happened, because instead of staying dead, Gojo awakened to a level of power that was beyond anything the Jujutsu world had ever seen. And when he came back, he uttered those famous words throughout heaven and earth: "I alone am the honored one." And while many people interpret this as arrogance, I think it's actually the moment when Gojo truly understood the curse of his existence, because he realized that his power would always separate him from everyone else, that he would always be alone at the top. And it's clear that this wasn't just a power awakening. It was the moment Gojo realized he would always be alone at the top, and that his strength, while making him nearly invincible, also made him fundamentally unreachable to almost everyone around him. And this realization would haunt him for the rest of his life. But the real tragedy was still to come, because while Gojo was dealing with his new understanding of his power, his best friend Geto was going through his own crisis. And this is where we see the cruel irony of their situation, because just as Gojo was becoming more powerful and more isolated, Geto was becoming more disillusioned with the world they were trying to protect. And the mission to protect Riko had failed. They couldn't save her. And this failure hit Geto harder than anyone realized, because he started to question whether protecting non-sorcerers was worth the sacrifice, when those same people often hated and feared sorcerers. And Gojo, in his newfound power and confidence, failed to notice that his best friend was drowning in doubt and despair. And maybe this is where we see the first real consequence of Gojo's strength, because his power made it easy for him to brush off failures and setbacks. But Geto didn't have that luxury, and as Geto spiraled deeper into his crisis, he began to develop a different philosophy, one where sorcerers were superior to non-sorcerers and deserved to rule over them. And the tragic thing is that if Gojo had been paying attention, if he had been able to see past his own power and really look at his friend, maybe he could have helped, maybe he could have stopped what was coming, but he didn't. And the distance created by his awakening meant that he missed all the warning signs until it was too late. And when Geto finally snapped and killed an entire village of non-sorcerers, it was already over. And the final confrontation between them was heartbreaking, because here were two best friends who had once been inseparable, now standing on opposite sides of an ideological divide. And when it came time for Gojo to stop Geto, he couldn't do it. He couldn't kill the one person who had truly understood him. And this moment of hesitation would haunt him forever, because by letting Geto go, he was essentially allowing him to continue down a path of destruction. And could it be that Gojo's later obsession with his students stems from his failure to save the one person who truly understood him? Maybe his dedication to teaching is his way of trying to prevent another Geto from happening again. And this brings us to one of the most interesting periods of Gojo's life, when he made the decision to become a teacher at Jujutsu High. Because on the surface, this choice might seem strange. Why would the strongest sorcerer in the world want to spend his time teaching teenagers? But when you understand Gojo's psychology, it makes perfect sense, because teaching gave him something. He desperately needed a way to form meaningful connections without the complications of his overwhelming power. And interesting how Gojo's teaching style directly opposes everything he experienced as a student. Because where he was isolated and treated as a weapon, he goes out of his way to make his students feel supported and valued as individuals. And his relationship with Megumi Fushiguro is particularly fascinating, because Megumi is the son of Toji, the man who killed Gojo, and yet Gojo has essentially adopted him as his own. And this isn't just about guilt or obligation, it's about Gojo recognizing potential in Megumi and wanting to nurture it properly. And then there's his relationship with Yuji Itadori, which is equally complex, because Yuji represents everything that Gojo values about humanity: his kindness, his willingness to sacrifice for others, his ability to see the good in people even when they're cursed. And through teaching, Yuji Gojo gets to experience vicariously what it means to be truly human, to struggle and grow and connect with others in ways that his own power has always prevented him from doing. And with Nobara Kujisaki, he sees someone who refuses to be defined by others' expectations, someone who insists on being herself, regardless of what the world thinks. And this resonates with Gojo, because it's what he's been trying to do his whole life: be human, despite being superhuman. And through all of these relationships, Gojo slowly begins to heal from the trauma of losing Geto, because his students give him hope that the next generation can be better. that they can have the connections, and understanding that he never really had. And maybe most importantly, they remind him that strength isn't just about power, it's about the people you choose to protect and the legacy you leave behind. And this is why the teaching era represents such growth for Gojo, because he's learning to use his strength not just to fight curses, but to nurture and protect the future of the Jujutsu world. But just when it seemed like Gojo had found his purpose and his peace, the Shibuya incident happened. And this event represents one of the cruelest ironies in the entire series, because the very thing that made Gojo grow as a person, increased humanity and care for innocent people, is exactly what his enemies used to trap him. And the plan orchestrated by Kinjaku was diabolical in its simplicity, because they knew that Gojo had changed, that he was no longer the cold, detached sorcerer who cared only about strength. They knew that he had developed genuine compassion for ordinary people, and they used that compassion against him by filling Shibuya with innocent civilians and forcing him to hold back his true power, because using his full strength would have meant sacrificing thousands of innocent lives. And this put Gojo in an impossible position where his greatest strength became useless because he couldn't unleash it without becoming the very thing he had spent his life fighting against. And when they finally managed to seal him using the prison realm, it wasn't because they overpowered him, it was because they outmaneuvered him emotionally and psychologically. And the tragic irony is that if Gojo had remained the isolated and uncaring person he was before meeting Geto and teaching his students, he probably would have escaped the trap easily. But his growth as a human being, his development of empathy and compassion made him vulnerable in a way that raw power never could. And maybe the sealing was exactly what had to happen for his students to truly grow, because as long as Gojo was there as the ultimate safety net, they would never have to face their full potential. But with him gone, they were forced to step up and become the sorcerers he always believed they could be. And this brings us to the final chapter of Gojo's story, his battle against Sukuna, which represents the ultimate test not just of his power, but of everything he had learned about strength and connection throughout his life. And when Gojo finally emerged from the prison realm, after being sealed for so long, he came out not as the isolated god he once was, but as someone who had found peace with his role in the world. And his fight against Sukuna wasn't just about proving who was stronger. It was about protecting the future that he had helped to create through his students. And in his final moments, Gojo wasn't thinking about his own legacy or his own power. He was thinking about the people he cared about and the world he was leaving behind. And his death, while tragic, was also in many ways the completion of his character arc, because he had finally learned to use his strength not for his own glory, but for something greater than himself. And the beautiful thing about Gojo's final battle is that even in death, he achieved victory, not through overpowering his enemy, but through the legacy he had created, because his students, the people he had taught and inspired, were able to continue the fight without him. And this represents the ultimate evolution of his understanding of strength, because true strength isn't about being the most powerful individual. It's about empowering others to be strong in their own right and creating a world where that strength can flourish. So was Gojo truly the strongest or the most human? And I think the answer is that he was both. And that's what made his story so compelling, because his journey was about learning that these two things don't have to be mutually exclusive, that you can be incredibly powerful and still maintain your humanity and connection to others. And his story teaches us something profound about the curse of being born different, because when you're exceptional in any way, whether it's through talent or intelligence, or in Gojo's case, otherworldly power, it can be incredibly isolating because people relate to what you can do rather than who you are. But Gojo's story also shows us that it's possible to overcome that isolation through genuine connection and through using your gifts, not just for yourself, but for others. And the choice between isolation and vulnerability is one that we all face in our own lives, because it's always easier to keep people at a distance to protect ourselves from the possibility of pain. But true strength, true connection requires us to be vulnerable, to risk being hurt in order to experience genuine love and understanding. Gojo's story teaches us that true strength comes from the relationships we build and the people we inspire, not from the power we wield. And that legacy, the impact we have on others, is what really matters. In the end, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the tragic and beautiful life of Satoru Gojo, you'll probably love my analysis of Suguru Geto's fall from grace, or my breakdown of how Sukuna represents the dark mirror of Gojo's journey. Both videos explore similar themes of power, isolation, and the choices we make when faced with overwhelming strength. So be sure to check those out. And if this video helped you understand Gojo's character in in a new way, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the psychology and philosophy of your favorite anime characters. And remember, throughout heaven and earth, we are never truly alone when we choose to connect with others. Have a good one.